Hello family, welcome to Stories with JAYVIL. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and remember to turn on the post notifications so you don't miss any future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Now sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The town of Tama had never seen a wedding like this. The Johnsons, the wealthiest family in the region, were hosting a grand celebration to welcome a new bride into their household. Their youngest son, David Johnson, was marrying a beautiful young woman named Claire Anderson, a quiet and graceful lady who had captured his heart. The wedding was the talk of the town, with guests arriving in their finest attire to witness the union. The Johnson estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by manicured gardens and tall gates, was adorned with colorful decorations and shimmering lights. The air buzzed with excitement as locals and dignitaries mingled, marveling at the extravagance. Margaret Johnson, the family matriarch, moved among the crowd with an air of authority, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. Beside her stood Laura, her eldest daughter, equally proud and imposing. As Claire arrived dressed in an elegant but modest white gown, she felt a mixture of excitement and unease. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, yet something in the way Margaret and Laura looked at her made her feel small. She had been warned about the Johnsons' pride, their obsession with status and wealth, but she had hoped her love for David would be enough to bridge any gap. David, her charming and handsome groom, was waiting for her at the altar. He smiled warmly as she approached, his confidence radiating. "You look beautiful," he whispered as he took her hand. For a moment Claire's doubts faded. In that instant she believed that love would conquer all, that her sincerity and devotion would win over his family. The ceremony was a grand affair. The priest spoke of love and commitment, while the guests whispered about Claire's background. Unlike the Johnsons, Claire had arrived in Tama quietly, with no entourage or fanfare. To many, she appeared to be a simple girl from a modest background. No one, not even David, knew the truth that she was the only daughter of Robert Anderson, a billionaire whose influence spanned continents. Claire had chosen to keep her wealth a secret, longing to be loved for who she was, not for what she had. As the couple exchanged vows, Margaret whispered to Laura, "She doesn't even look like she belongs here. What does she bring to this family?" Laura smirked. "Nothing but her looks," she replied dismissively. After the ceremony, the reception began. Lavish food and drinks were served, and the guests danced and celebrated. Yet amid the joy, Claire couldn't ignore the icy stares and veiled comments from her new in-laws. That night, as Claire and David retired to their new home on the Johnson estate, she felt the weight of the expectations and hostility that awaited her. While David was cheerful and oblivious, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that her journey in the Johnson family was about to become far more challenging than she had ever imagined. This was not the fairy tale beginning she had hoped for. It was the start of a test that would reveal her true strength. The honeymoon phase was short-lived for Claire. The day after the wedding, the reality of her new life began to settle in. The Johnson household was a bustling hive of activity, but it quickly became clear to Claire that her role within it was not what she had expected. While she had imagined mornings spent with her new husband and afternoons bonding with her in-laws, she instead found herself at the mercy of Margaret and Laura. It started subtly with snide remarks and sharp glances. Claire had woken early that morning, eager to make a good impression. She prepared breakfast for the family, a gesture she thought would show her appreciation. When Margaret entered the dining room and saw Claire setting the table, she paused, her expression critical. "What are you doing?" Margaret asked, her tone more accusatory than curious. "I thought I'd prepare breakfast for everyone," Claire replied, smiling warmly. Margaret let out a short laugh. "We have staff for that. Or did you think this was your father's house, where you could play the perfect wife?" Claire's smile faltered, but she said nothing. She could feel Laura's eyes on her, watching with a smirk as if waiting for her to slip up. As the days passed, the hostility grew more apparent. Margaret would make cutting remarks about Claire's lack of sophistication. "You don't even know how to dress for an evening dinner," she said one night, eyeing Claire's simple gown. Laura was no better, constantly finding ways to belittle her. One afternoon, as Claire attempted to help the house staff clean up after lunch, Laura approached her in the kitchen. "You don't need to pretend to be helpful," Laura said with a sly grin. "We all know you're trying to earn favor with Mother. But it won't work. You'll never be good enough for this family." The words stung, but Claire refused to let them show. "I'm not trying to earn anything," she said calmly. "I'm just trying to be a part of this family." Laura laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "A part of this family? Oh, Claire, you'll never be more than David's mistake." That evening, Claire confided in David, hoping for comfort and support. But instead of understanding, she was met with indifference. "You know how my family can be," David said dismissively, barely looking up from his phone. "Just ignore them. They'll come around eventually." "But they're treating me like I don't belong here," Claire said, her voice trembling. David sighed, clearly irritated. "Claire, don't make a big deal out of this. You're my wife now. That's all that matters." But it didn't feel like all that mattered. With each passing day, Claire felt more like an outsider in her own home. Margaret and Laura's disdain grew bolder, and David's indifference deepened her loneliness. Claire began to wonder if she had made a mistake by marrying into this family. But deep down, she resolved to persevere. She had vowed to love David and make this marriage work, no matter the obstacles. Little did she know, the challenges she faced were only the beginning. Claire woke up earlier than usual, determined to make the most of her day. She had started a habit of waking before the rest of the family, hoping to avoid their sharp glances and cutting words. But even her efforts to stay invisible weren't enough to shield her from Margaret and Laura's growing disdain. It began subtly enough, with Margaret instructing Claire to assist with minor household tasks. "Since you're up early, why don't you help organize the pantry?" "It's been a mess for weeks," Margaret said one morning, sipping her tea as she lounged in the sitting room. Claire, ever eager to please, obliged without hesitation. But what started as small tasks quickly snowballed into something more insidious. Over time, Margaret and Laura began assigning Claire the kinds of chores typically reserved for the house staff. Cleaning the floors, washing the dishes, and even ironing their clothes became her new responsibilities. "You should be grateful," Margaret said one afternoon as she handed Claire a basket of laundry. "Doing work around the house will teach you humility. It's not like you brought anything to this family except your pretty face." Claire bit her tongue, forcing a polite smile as she carried the laundry to the washing area. She had always prided herself on her patience, but the constant disrespect was beginning to wear her down. Laura, on the other hand, took every opportunity to mock Claire. One evening, as Claire scrubbed the kitchen floor, Laura walked in, holding a glass of wine. "You know," Laura began, leaning casually against the counter, "you really do look the part of a maid. Maybe that's why David married you, to save money on housekeeping." Claire paused, her hands trembling, but she didn't respond. She had learned that arguing with Laura only made things worse. David, oblivious to the tension in the household, was rarely home to witness his wife's struggles. When Claire tried to bring it up, he brushed it aside. "They're just testing you," he said one night when Claire tearfully recounted her day. "They'll come around eventually. Just give it time." "But David," Claire pleaded, "they don't treat me like family." "They treat me like a servant," David shrugged. "That's how they are. Don't take it personally." His words felt like a slap in the face. Claire had expected her husband to stand up for her, to be her partner in the face of adversity. Instead, she felt abandoned, left to navigate the Johnson household's hostility alone. As the weeks turned into months, Claire's role in the family became clear. She was no longer the wife of the youngest Johnson son. She was their maid, their scapegoat, their object of ridicule. Despite it all, Claire held her head high. She reminded herself of who she was, the daughter of Robert Anderson, a billionaire who had raised her to value kindness and resilience above all else. She had kept her identity hidden because she believed love should be about connection, not status. But as she scrubbed floors and endured the Johnsons' cruelty, she began to wonder if her secret had been a mistake. How much longer could she endure this humiliation before she finally broke? Unbeknownst to Claire, the Johnson family's true colors would soon be revealed, and the consequences of their actions would change their lives forever. Claire's suspicions about David began innocently enough. He had started coming home later than usual, always with a flimsy excuse. Work ran late, he would say, or I met up with some friends. At first she gave him the benefit of the doubt, believing that his distant behavior was due to stress. But the signs became harder to ignore. One evening, Claire overheard Margaret and Laura whispering in the sitting room. She paused at the doorway, the sound of her name catching her attention. "She's so dull," Margaret said with a sneer. "No wonder David is spending time with Emily. At least she knows how to keep a man interested." Claire's heart sank. Emily. She had heard the name before. Emily Turner was a well-known figure in Tama, a stunning socialite with a penchant for drama and a reputation for chasing wealthy men. The thought of David being involved with someone like her felt like a knife to Claire's heart. The whispers turned into rumors. Around town, people began to talk about David's growing closeness to Emily. The two were often seen together at upscale restaurants and private gatherings, their laughter and shared looks fueling the gossip. Claire tried to confront David, but every time she brought it up, he brushed her off. "Emily is just a friend," he said one night, barely looking up from his phone. "People love to talk, Claire. Don't let it get to you." But it did get to her. She couldn't shake the image of David and Emily together, laughing and enjoying each other's company while she was left alone, cleaning up after his family. Margaret, on the other hand, made no effort to hide her approval of Emily. She began dropping her name into conversations, praising her beauty and ambition. "Emily is exactly the kind of woman who can elevate this family," she said one evening, while Claire sat silently at the dinner table. "She's driven, confident, and comes from a respectable background." Laura chimed in, smirking as she sipped her wine. "Unlike some people," she added, her eyes flicking to Claire. The final blow came when Claire overheard Margaret and Laura discussing plans for David to marry Emily. Margaret was adamant. "This family needs someone like her," she said. "Claire is just there. She's not bringing anything to the table." Claire couldn't believe what she was hearing. They were planning to push her out of her own marriage. That night she confronted David again, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "Your mother and sister are talking about you marrying Emily," she said. "How can you let them disrespect me like this?" David's response was cold and dismissive. "Maybe they're right," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Emily understands me in ways you never will." Those words shattered Claire. She realized then that the man she had loved and trusted was no longer the person she thought he was. Alone in her room that night, Claire cried until she couldn't anymore. But as the tears dried, a new resolve began to take root in her heart. She had endured Margaret and Laura's cruelty, the whispers of the town, and now David's betrayal. But she was done being the victim. It was time to remind the Johnsons who she truly was. Little did they know, their lives were about to change forever. The days leading up to David and Emily's engagement announcement were a living nightmare for Claire. The whispers around the Johnson estate had turned into blatant conversations. Margaret and Laura openly discussed plans for the engagement party, speaking as if Claire didn't exist. Margaret, with her usual condescension, handed Claire a list of errands one morning. "Since you're so eager to be useful, why don't you pick up the decorations for the engagement party?" she said with a sneer. "After all, it's the least you can do." Claire stared at the list in disbelief. They were asking her to prepare for her husband's engagement to another woman. Her hands trembled as she took the paper, but she said nothing. She had learned that arguing with Margaret only gave her more ammunition. The town of Tama was abuzz with gossip. Everywhere Claire went, she could feel the stares and hear the murmurs. "Poor Claire," one shopkeeper whispered to another. "Imagine being replaced by someone like Emily." Another added, "The Johnsons don't deserve her. If only they knew who she really is." But Claire's resolve to keep her true identity a secret remained firm. Despite the humiliation, she held her head high and went about her tasks. She knew the Johnsons' arrogance blinded them, but she also knew their downfall was inevitable. The day of the engagement announcement arrived, and the Johnson estate was transformed into a spectacle of opulence. Margaret had spared no expense, determined to show off her family's wealth and Emily's supposed value to the Johnson name. Claire watched from the sidelines as the guests arrived in droves. She had been relegated to the kitchen, where she was tasked with overseeing the catering staff. Every now and then she caught a glimpse of David and Emily, standing together and basking in the attention of the crowd. "Doesn't she look stunning?" Margaret said loudly, gesturing toward Emily in her glamorous gown. "This is the kind of woman who can truly elevate our family." Laura smirked as she glanced toward the kitchen. "Unlike some people," she added, her voice dripping with mockery. Claire's chest tightened, but she refused to let them see her pain. She focused on her work, quietly planning her next move. This would be the last time she allowed the Johnsons to humiliate her. The moment of the announcement arrived, and Margaret gathered the guests in the grand living room. With a smug smile, she raised her glass. "Friends, family, and esteemed guests," she began. "It is with great pride that I announce the engagement of my son, David Johnson, to the lovely Emily Turner." The crowd erupted in applause, and Emily beamed as she clung to David's arm. Claire stood in the doorway, her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to cry, to scream, to lash out, but instead she forced herself to stay calm. She knew her time was coming. The Johnsons had underestimated her for far too long, and soon they would regret every insult, every humiliation, and every betrayal. As the applause died down, Margaret approached Claire with a smug grin. "Well, aren't you going to congratulate them?" she asked mockingly. "After all, you're still part of this family for now." Claire met Margaret's gaze, her voice steady and calm. "Congratulations indeed," she said, a hint of steel in her tone. "This is a day none of us will forget." Margaret laughed, oblivious to the storm brewing behind Claire's composed exterior. Little did she know, Claire had made a phone call earlier that day, a call that would change everything. Unbeknownst to the Johnsons, their reign of arrogance was about to come crashing down, and the quiet, unassuming woman they had underestimated would be the one to bring it all to an end. The grand engagement party for David and Emily was a spectacle like no other. The Johnson estate glittered with decorations, chandeliers casting their golden glow over the crowd of dignitaries, business elites, and prominent families of Tama. Margaret and Laura were in their element, parading Emily around like a trophy, ensuring everyone saw her as the future Mrs. David Johnson. Claire, dressed in a simple black dress, lingered near the back of the room. She hadn't been invited to the party officially, but had been asked to help the staff during the event. Her heart ached as she watched David laughing with Emily, the woman who had taken her place in his life. The humiliation was unbearable, but Claire had something Margaret and Laura didn't, a plan. As the party reached its peak, the sound of luxury cars pulling into the estate's driveway caused a stir among the guests. Heads turned and whispers filled the room. Claire's heart raced as she glanced at the clock. They were right on time. Margaret noticed the commotion and frowned. "What's going on out there?" she snapped at one of the staff members. "Who invited more guests?" Before anyone could respond, the main doors to the estate opened. A convoy of sleek black SUVs lined the driveway, and armed security guards stepped out first, their presence commanding attention. Moments later, Robert Anderson, Claire's father, emerged from one of the vehicles, his tailored suit and dignified air exuding power. By his side was Claire, no longer the quiet, submissive wife they had mistreated. She was poised, confident, and breathtakingly regal in a designer gown that sparkled under the evening lights. The room fell silent. Margaret's jaw dropped as Robert walked into the room, flanked by his security team. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the room, his piercing gaze landing on David, Emily, and finally Margaret. He walked forward, his steps deliberate, until he stood directly in front of Margaret. "How dare you treat my daughter like this?" he said, his voice calm but commanding. The weight of his words made everyone in the room hold their breath. Margaret blinked, confused. "Your daughter," she repeated, looking around as if expecting someone else to appear. Robert turned slightly and gestured toward Claire, who stepped forward, her chin held high. "Yes, Claire Anderson," he said, his tone sharp. "My only child, the heiress to my fortune, the woman you have insulted, humiliated, and treated like a maid." The gasps from the crowd were almost deafening. Guests began whispering furiously, piecing together the truth. Margaret stumbled backward, her face pale. This can't be true," she stammered. "It is," Claire said, her voice steady and filled with strength. She turned to face the entire room. "I kept my identity a secret because I wanted to be loved for who I am, not for what I have. But instead of love, I received nothing but cruelty." David, who had been frozen in shock, finally spoke. "Claire, I didn't know," he started, but Claire silenced him with a single look. "You knew who I was as a person, David," she said, "and you let your family destroy me. You let them push me aside for someone like Emily." Emily, who had been standing awkwardly beside David, took a step back, suddenly feeling very out of place. Robert stepped forward again. "You've humiliated my daughter for the last time," he said, his voice booming. "Every asset this family has benefited from, your business deals, your estate, even this party, was funded by me. As of this moment, I'm taking back every single thing I gave you." Margaret and Laura's faces turned white as the weight of his words sank in. As the guards began instructing the Johnson family to vacate the premises, Claire addressed the crowd one last time. "Let this be a lesson to everyone here," she said. "Never judge someone based on what you think they lack. True wealth isn't about money, it's about character." With that, Claire and Robert walked out of the estate, leaving the Johnson family in shambles and the guests stunned into silence. The party, which had started as a celebration of David and Emily's engagement, ended as a public humiliation for the Johnsons, a day no one in Tama would ever forget. As Claire and her father left the estate, the Johnson family stood frozen, their world crumbling around them. Margaret's voice was the first to break the silence. "This is a misunderstanding," she cried, rushing after Robert. "Surely we can talk about this." Robert stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "There's nothing to talk about, Mrs. Johnson," he said coldly. "You had every chance to treat my daughter with respect, but instead you chose cruelty. Now you'll live with the consequences." Margaret's confident demeanor shattered. She looked at David, who stood in stunned silence, his gaze locked on Claire. "Claire, please," he began, taking a step forward. "I didn't know." "Stop," Claire said sharply, her voice echoing across the room. "You knew enough, David. You knew how they treat me, and you let it happen. Worse, you betrayed me." Her eyes flicked toward Emily, who was now trying to slip into the background. "Enjoy your life with Emily. She seems to understand you in ways I never could." David opened his mouth to argue, but the weight of his guilt silenced him. The crowd, once filled with laughter and celebration, now murmured with judgment and disbelief. The mighty Johnson family, stripped of their wealth and reputation, stood exposed for their arrogance and greed. Robert's team moved quickly. The estate, once a symbol of the Johnson power, was emptied of its luxuries. Vehicles were repossessed, bank accounts frozen, and documents revoked. Margaret clung to a shred of hope, believing she could negotiate, but each attempt was met with silence from Robert's team. Claire watched from the edge of the driveway, her heart heavy but resolute. For months she had endured their disdain, hoping for love and acceptance. But this moment wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming her dignity. As Robert approached her, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you ready to go, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Claire nodded, sparing one last glance at David, whose face was a mix of regret and desperation. "I'm ready," she said firmly. The news of the Johnsons' downfall spread like wildfire through Tama. Once admired for their wealth and influence, they became the subject of pity and ridicule. Guests who had attended the engagement party recounted the dramatic turn of events, their opinions shifting overnight. David tried to contact Claire multiple times, but his messages went unanswered. He visited her family's estate in the city, only to be turned away at the gates. Emily, sensing the loss of wealth and status, quietly ended her relationship with David, leaving him to face his family's ruin alone. Margaret and Laura, once the queens of Toma, found themselves struggling to maintain their lifestyle. The estate, now stripped of its grandeur, became a stark reminder of their fall from grace. Their treatment of Claire became a cautionary tale, a lesson in humility that the town wouldn't soon forget. As Claire settled back into her life at her father's mansion, she reflected on the whirlwind of events. She had entered her marriage hoping for love and acceptance, but she had left it with a renewed sense of self-worth. "I should have told you sooner," Robert said one evening as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the city. "But I wanted you to find your own path." Claire smiled faintly. "I needed to learn this lesson myself," she replied. "I know my worth now, and I won't let anyone diminish it again." Her father nodded, pride shining in his eyes. "And the world knows who you are now. Never hide that again." Claire's story became a legend in Tamaha, a tale shared in hushed tones about the dangers of arrogance and the power of resilience. The Johnsons learned too late that true wealth lies not in money or status, but in kindness and respect. And Claire, now free from the shadows of humiliation and betrayal, began a new chapter of her life, one built on her own terms, surrounded by people who truly valued her for the extraordinary woman she was. The aftermath of the engagement party was chaos for the Johnson family. The once proud matriarch Margaret sat in the now bare living room, staring at the blank walls that had once been adorned with priceless artwork. Laura paced the floor, her usual sharp tongue silenced by the magnitude of their downfall. David, the golden boy of the family, sat in the corner, his head in his hands, replaying every moment of his betrayal in his mind. Margaret's voice finally broke the silence. "We can fix this," she said, though her tone lacked the confidence it once carried. "We just need to talk to Robert, apologize, beg if we must." "Beg?" Laura snapped, her voice trembling with indignation. "Do you hear yourself, Mother? We've lost everything because of her." She spat Claire's name as though it were venom. David, silent until now, lifted his head. "No," he said quietly, "it wasn't her fault. It was us. We did this to ourselves." Margaret turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You're defending her after what she did to this family." David stood, his shoulders slumped. "She didn't do anything but love me, and I threw that away. You treated her like dirt, and I let you. What did you expect would happen?" His words hung heavy in the room, a bitter truth none of them wanted to face. Meanwhile, Claire was adjusting to life back at her father's mansion in the city. It was a strange feeling, stepping back into a world of luxury and influence after months of being treated as though she were invisible. The staff at the estate greeted her with warmth and deference, a stark contrast to the cold disdain she had endured in the Johnson household. But Claire wasn't content to simply return to her old life. She wanted to use her experience to make a difference. She began working with her father's foundation, focusing on helping women who had been mistreated or underestimated in their relationships. "I know what it feels like to be stripped of your worth," she told a group of women at her first event. "But I also know how to take it back." Her story inspired many, and soon she became a beacon of hope and resilience for others in the community. In Tama, the Johnson family's fall from grace became a cautionary tale. Their estate, once the pinnacle of luxury, was sold off piece by piece to pay debts that had quietly accumulated over the years. The townspeople who once revered the Johnsons now pitied them or worse, mocked them. David attempted to rebuild his life, but his reputation was irreparably damaged. Emily, seeing no future with a broke and disgraced man, disappeared without a word. Margaret and Laura, unable to bear the humiliation, retreated into isolation, their once bold personalities dulled by the weight of their failure. One rainy afternoon, David arrived unannounced at Robert Anderson's estate. Drenched and visibly shaken, he asked to see Claire. The guards hesitated but eventually relayed the message to Claire, who was in the middle of a meeting. When she stepped into the grand foyer and saw him standing there, soaked and defeated, she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite define. Pity, anger, closure. "What do you want, David?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. David looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I came to apologize," he said. "For everything. I was weak. I let my family dictate my life, and I destroyed the one good thing I had. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you." "I was wrong." Claire studied him for a moment. He looked nothing like the confident, carefree man she had married. This was a man who had been broken by his own choices. "I appreciate your apology," she said finally. "But it changes nothing. I've moved on, David." "I suggest you do the same," David nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "You deserve better," he said quietly, before turning and walking out into the rain. As the rain poured outside, Claire returned to her meeting, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. She had reclaimed her dignity, her identity, and her future. The Johnsons' chapter in her life was closed, and she was ready to write a new one. With her father's unwavering support and her newfound purpose, Claire became a force to be reckoned with. A woman who had faced betrayal and humiliation but had risen stronger than ever. Tama would never forget the name Claire Anderson, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience and grace. Claire's life blossomed after her confrontation with the Johnsons. No longer burdened by their toxicity, she poured her energy into projects that gave her a sense of purpose. At her father's insistence, she became a prominent figure in the Anderson Foundation, advocating for women's empowerment and financial independence. Her first major initiative was a program to support women who had faced emotional or financial abuse in their marriages. "Strength is not in enduring abuse," Claire often said during her speeches, "but in knowing when to walk away and reclaim your worth." Her words resonated with many, and soon women from all over Tama and beyond came to her for guidance. Claire also became a beloved figure in Tama itself. She didn't shy away from the town where she had been humiliated, but instead embraced it, showing the residents who the real Claire Anderson was. She funded scholarships for young girls, renovated the local community center, and set up small businesses for women in need. The people of Tama, who had once whispered about her, now admired her resilience and generosity. Meanwhile, the Johnson family's fall from grace was complete. Their once grand estate was sold to pay off mounting debts, forcing them to move into a modest house on the outskirts of Tama. Margaret, who had ruled her household with an iron fist, now spent her days in bitter silence. Laura, who had always been quick with a cutting remark, avoided public outings altogether, unable to face the judgmental stares of the townspeople. David, however, was determined to rebuild his life. He had taken up a job at a local mechanic shop, a far cry from the glamorous life he had once known. The work was grueling, but it gave him time to reflect on his choices. He often thought about Claire and the life they could have had if he had valued her for who she was. Despite their struggles, the Johnsons were now pariahs in Tama. The townspeople, who had once envied their wealth, now pitied their fall. The family's arrogance had cost them everything, and they had no one to blame but themselves. One sunny afternoon, Claire stood on the balcony of her father's mansion, overlooking the bustling city below. She was preparing for a charity gala she was hosting that evening, an event that would bring together influential figures from across the country. Her father, Robert, joined her on the balcony, a glass of wine in his hand. "You've done well, my dear," he said, pride evident in his voice. "I always knew you were capable of great things, but seeing you here, stronger than ever, fills me with joy." Claire smiled. "I wouldn't be here without you, Dad. You gave me the foundation to stand tall, even when everything around me was falling apart." Robert nodded. "You learned the most important lesson in life. Never let anyone define your worth. That's a strength no one can take away." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The past was behind her and the future was hers to shape. She had walked through fire and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. At the gala that evening, Claire mingled effortlessly with the guests, her confidence and poise commanding attention. As she spoke with a group of donors, a familiar figure caught her eye. It was Daniel King, a successful entrepreneur and an old acquaintance from her university days. Daniel had always admired Claire's intelligence and grace, though their paths had drifted apart over the years. "Claire," he said, approaching her with a warm smile. "It's been too long." "It has," Claire replied, surprised but pleased to see him. They quickly fell into conversation, reminiscing about old times and discussing their shared passion for philanthropy. Daniel, who had always respected Claire, was impressed by her transformation and the work she had accomplished. By the end of the evening, he extended an invitation. I'm hosting a seminar on business and social impact next month. I'd love for you to be a guest speaker. Claire hesitated for a moment but then nodded. I'd be honored. In the days that followed, news of Claire's continued success spread across Tama, and her name became synonymous with resilience and empowerment. The Johnson family, watching from their modest home, couldn't ignore the stark contrast between their lives and Claire's. David, in particular, was haunted by the realization of what he had lost. He knew he could never regain Claire's love, but he hoped to at least make amends for his actions. Whether she would ever forgive him was another matter entirely. Margaret and Laura, once so proud and arrogant, began to see the error of their ways. Their fall from grace had stripped them of their pride, leaving them with nothing but time to reflect on their cruelty. They understood now that their treatment of Claire had been not only wrong but deeply foolish. Claire's life was moving forward, her influence growing with every step. The Johnsons, left to grapple with their downfall, had faded into the background of her story. But one thing was clear: Claire's journey wasn't just about overcoming betrayal. It was about rediscovering herself and proving to the world and to herself that no one could break her spirit. The stage was set for Claire's next chapter, one where she would rise even higher, leaving the shadows of her past far behind. And though the Johnsons watched her ascent with regret, they knew one thing for sure: Claire Anderson was a force to be reckoned with, and she would never be underestimated again. Months had passed since the dramatic engagement party that changed everything. Claire's life had transformed into one of purpose and fulfillment, leaving the Johnsons and their betrayal far behind. Yet as much as she had moved on, the lessons she learned from her ordeal in Tama stayed with her, shaping her into the resilient and influential woman she had become. Claire had become a prominent figure in philanthropy, known for her unwavering commitment to helping others, especially women who had been overlooked or underestimated. She spearheaded programs to provide financial literacy and entrepreneurial training, often sharing her own story of humiliation and triumph to inspire others. At one such event in Tama, Claire stood before a packed audience in the newly renovated community center, one she had funded. Her voice was steady, filled with conviction. "I once believed that love meant enduring anything," she said. "But love without respect is not love at all. Your worth is not defined by anyone else's opinion of you. It's defined by how you choose to see yourself." The applause was thunderous, and Claire felt a wave of satisfaction. This was her way of giving back to the community that had watched her rise from humiliation to success. The people of Tama, many of whom had gossiped about her, now looked at her with admiration. Back at the Johnsons' modest home on the outskirts of Tama, the atmosphere was somber. The family's once grand estate was gone, sold to pay off their debts. Margaret, once the proud matriarch, had grown quiet and withdrawn. Laura rarely ventured out, her sharp tongue silenced by the humiliation of losing everything. David, however, was the one who struggled the most. He had taken a job at a local hardware store, a far cry from the glamorous life he had once known. Every day was a reminder of what he had lost, not just material wealth, but Claire. He often replayed his mistakes in his mind, wondering how different things could have been if he had stood by her instead of betraying her trust. One evening, Margaret finally broke her silence. "We brought this on ourselves," she admitted, her voice filled with regret. "Claire was the best thing that ever happened to this family, and we destroyed her." David nodded but said nothing. The truth of his mother's words weighed heavily on him. One afternoon, David saw Claire in town. She was speaking with a group of women, her presence commanding attention. She looked radiant, her confidence and kindness shining through. For a moment, David hesitated, unsure whether to approach her. Finally, he gathered his courage and walked over. "Claire," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. Claire turned, surprised to see him. "David," she replied, her tone neutral but polite. I wanted to thank you," he said, struggling to find the words. "For everything, for showing me what I should have been, what I could have been. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope one day you can see that I've changed." Claire studied him for a moment. She saw the weight of his guilt, the sincerity in his eyes. "David," she said softly, "I forgave you a long time ago. Not for you, but for me. Holding on to anger doesn't serve me, but forgiveness doesn't mean I'll forget. David nodded, his throat tightening. I understand. Thank you. With that, Claire walked away, leaving David to reflect on the woman he had lost, the woman he would never have again. That evening, Claire attended a private dinner with Daniel King, the successful entrepreneur she had reconnected with at her charity gala. Over the past few months, their relationship had grown into something meaningful. Daniel respected Claire for her strength and admired her for her compassion. As they walked through the city after dinner, Daniel turned to her. You've built something incredible, Claire. You've turned pain into power. I hope you know how inspiring you are. Claire smiled, her heart full. Thank you, Daniel. I've learned that life is about what we make of it. We can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we rise from it. Claire's story became a tale told in Tama and beyond, a story of resilience, humility, and the strength to rise above betrayal. The Johnson family's downfall served as a reminder of the dangers of arrogance and cruelty, while Claire's triumph inspired countless others to reclaim their worth. In the end, Claire proved that true wealth isn't measured by money or possessions, but by character, compassion, and the courage to live authentically. As she looked out at the horizon, ready to embrace whatever the future held, Claire knew one thing for certain. She would never let anyone define her worth again. Her story wasn't just one of survival, it was a story of victory, and it was only the beginning. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.